Hey there, Kimmer here. Today we're going to learn a little bit about functions, at least just the basics and how they work and how to create one and how to write functions. So let's get started. First thing we want to do is take a program that you kind of already know. So let's take a look at this program here. This program doesn't have any functions other than the main. And remember, the main function is the driver function. You have to have that to run. So this particular program here is just going to create three variables, num1, num2, and sum. It's going to ask the user for a number and put it into num1. It's going to ask the user for another number, put it into num2, add the two together, come up with the sum, print the sum. Now, I know I'm using a very simple example, but rather than cloud something new if you've never done functions before, with a very difficult example, I'd rather keep it something simple. The first thing I'd like to do is to eliminate this printf and create a function that will actually print it for me. So the first thing I want you to do is go down below the current function here. So you'll notice int main starts here, ends here. We're going to go ahead and we are going to create a new function. So let me just start typing it and I'll explain it. Now functions have names, just like variables did. So what we're going to do is we're going to give it a name that basically shows people what it does. In this case, it's going to print the sum. Personally, I like to use two words put together, a verb-noun phrase, if you will. So we're going to call this print sum. Now, in order for the sum to be printed, it would have to know the sum. So whatever you have to tell it would go here. In this case, I'm going to do this. You'll notice you'll have open, close curly braces. Okay. And instead of this printf being right here, now remember where that was, I'm going to cut this from here and paste it down here. So you'll notice that this particular function is going to print the sum. That's all it is. It's going to take it in and take it from here and go ahead and print it. Now it's not going to work yet because we haven't called it. Remember, main only does exactly what's inside of main, so it's going to do just these things and then stop. So if we want to tell it, we have to call the print sum. You always call a function by its name, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Then we're going to give it what it wants. In this case, it wants the sum. The last thing we need to do then is to copy this line. It's the easiest thing to do. Paste it, put a semicolon at the end, and call it a day. Now what this does, this is called a prototype, and what it does is when it gets to main and it starts doing all of this, it gets to this print sum, and sometimes it'll panic because it doesn't know that print sum is a function that exists. This just allows it to say, hey, yeah, this exists. So now if we save it, compile it, and run it, this should work. So let's try. Let's do 10 and 5. The sum of your numbers is 15. So that works. I'm going to back off on this so you can see the whole thing at once, and then we're going to talk about the different parts. The part that we created, the void print sum float sum, the entire thing is called a function definition. It defines what the function does. The first line that we see above the curly braces is called the function header. And if you think about it, it's like a person. A head sits on top of a body. So anything inside the curly braces is known as the body. All function statements go inside the body. Please note, function definitions do not go inside of other functions. They have to be outside. They are separate things. The next thing we did was we called the function. So you'll notice that this is a function call. Then the part up at the top I said was called a prototype. The prototype and the function call and the function header all have to rather match. They all have to have the same name. They have to have the same number of things. So let's talk about those things. The first thing I want to point out is the name of the function. That's easy. Print sum. But you'll notice that I have, in parentheses, a float sum. This is because functions can only see the variables that it has. So I've created a function and I put it inside of here. This is known as a parameter. So when somebody calls this function, they have to give it a float number. And whatever float number is given, that's what the print sum function is going to print. And then it's done. You'll notice the word void there instead of maybe int main, because remember int returns an integer. This doesn't have a return statement, therefore we put void when we're not returning anything. And we'll see what that does in just a minute. So in the call, we send it sum. Now keep in mind that the sum in main and the sum in print sum are actually two different cups, or two different variables, two different containers, if you will. And when we call the one, we give it the number, we then send it, it catches it in the float sum in our print, and it goes ahead and it prints it. So those are called arguments. So on the call, it's an argument, but on the function header, it's called a parameter. They sometimes go by different names, but I'm going to use those for right now. An easy way to remember it, just remember that you call and start a fight, right? Argument is just another name for a fight, so let's just say we're going to call and start a fight. So on the call, that's where the arguments are. Otherwise, they're parameters. Let's continue. Okay, let's assume that now I don't want to do this math here, but rather I want to create a separate function that will add these two numbers together. But I'm going to need it to give me the answer. So we're going to start with the function definition. So we're going to start down here, and we're going to give it a name. So now we're going to start its name. Remember, verb, noun. So what's it going to do? Add numbers. Well, that's what I'm going to call it. What does it need to know in order to add the numbers? Well, it needs to know num1 and num2. Now you'll notice in this line a couple of things. Notice I repeated the word float, which is very different from what we did up here. In function headers, every variable should have its own data type. If it doesn't, it's going to automatically default to an int, or some compilers may not like it. Just going to depend. So just get in the habit of putting it for each one. Now, it's going to have to do this math problem. So let's pull this math problem out. Put that into here. However, I need a variable called sum. I know there's one in main, and I know there's one in print sum, but it doesn't matter. That function can't see any of those. It can only see what's inside of it. And there is no variable for sum. So I can go ahead and do sum. Now the only thing is, I can go ahead and add these two numbers together, but unless I return it back to the main, it's going to do me no good. So this is where we're going to introduce the return statement, and we're going to tell it to return the sum. Now, when you return sum here, okay, sum has a data type. Whatever the data type of what you're returning, that goes here. So this part of the header is known as the return data type. So we have the return data type, we have the function name, and we have the parameters. All of those together make up the function header. Then remember, the head sits on top of the body, and there's our function definition. So the whole thing is the function definition. Don't forget that. Next thing I need to do, or want to do in this case, is I want to call the add numbers function. And I'm going to send it the two numbers because that's what it wants. And because it's returning something to me, I am going to assign that to my variable. Now remember, my variable is different from add numbers variable. Add numbers has their variable here. I have mine up here. So whatever number that he returns to me, I'm going to do that. And do you remember what this particular thing is called here? That's the assignment operator. So we're going to go ahead and assign that to sum. Once we have the sum, then we can go ahead and print it. The last thing that we're forgetting is prototype. So we're going to go ahead and throw the prototype up at the top and save it, compile it, and we're going to run it again, giving it the same data, 10, 5. Sum of your numbers is 15. So now we've added two functions. I'm going to go ahead now and do a third function. This function is going to take the place of enter number. So we're going to call it something. Let's call it, let me see, how about just ask for number. Now, in order for it to ask for a number, a couple things to note. In order for me to do this Ask the user for a number. Is there a number I need to know? Hopefully you said no. I don't already need to know the number. If I already know the number, then why am I asking? So in this case, I don't need to put anything in as parameters. However, I do want it to do, well, we're going to have it do this one. Let's cut that out, put that here. So it's going to ask the user for a number. I do have to declare my variable. Now in this case, I'm just going to do num instead of num2 because it's just one number. And then I'm going to return whatever that number is. So my return data type would then be float. So this function doesn't need anything to get started, declares its own variable, asks the user for a number, returns the number. Okay, so now I'm going to put that number into num2 when I call the askNumber function. And then don't forget, we have to do the prototype. And semicolon. Save it, compile it, run it. And we're going to do 10 and 5, and it's still the same. So on the onset, you don't notice anything behind the scenes. You just know it runs the way it's supposed to. Okay, so let's talk about this one for a second. I need to ask for another number. A lot of people might want to do that in the askNumber function. However, with C, the problem is we can only return one thing. Remember that. We can only return one thing. I'll teach you a way to get around that much later, but for right now, we can only return one thing. It's like a calculator. If you plug in 6 times 7 plus 4 divided by 3, and you give it all these numbers, and you hit the equal sign, how many answers do you expect? Just one. So we're going to go ahead and we can only return one. So if this can only return one, do we have to write another function that will ask for another number? Hopefully you said no. Instead, we don't need this anymore. We can call this function here and ask for a number, but this time, we're going to tell it to put it into num1. So we can call the function as many times as we want, and that's kind of the point of functions, so we don't have to repeat code. So let's try it. I'm going to go ahead and save it. We're going to compile. We're going to run it. We're going to give it our 10 and 5, and we'll see 15 again. Now, a couple things to talk about. A lot of people are asking themselves right now, why in the heck would we go through all that trouble just to add 2 numbers? Typically you wouldn't. I just wanted to use this example to show you how to do a couple different types of functions. Functions that don't have any parameters but return a value. Functions that have parameters and return a value. And functions that take in parameters but don't return a value. So you can do a bunch of different combinations of this. So these are your functions. One thing to note, in memory, these 3 belong to main and they cannot be seen anywhere else. So I want to show you a little trick. Notice I'm sending the values of num1 and num2, which are obtained right here and right here. However, I didn't have to call these num1 and num2. I could have called these x and y. Now I'm not saying that you should, because x and y are not necessarily great variable names. But it doesn't matter. Whatever I name my variable here, as long as I'm using it only in here, it really doesn't matter. It's going to work the same. And so just to show you that I changed these variable names and run. And let me show you what's going on here. There you go. Doesn't change a thing. Computer doesn't care what you call them. So they don't have to be the same. A lot of programmers like to keep them the same. So that I'll leave that entirely up to you. But keep in mind, sometimes you don't have to. And you sometimes want it to be generic. Notice in this case I just said float num instead of num1, num2. I could ask somebody for 10 or 15 different numbers. I can be called so many different times, and it doesn't matter. I'm just going to keep reusing this variable over and over and over again. So this is your introduction to functions. So you probably are thinking, you wouldn't go through all of that when you're actually writing functions from the beginning. So the next couple of minutes, I'm just going to rewrite it as if I were to write it using functions first. So let's get started with that. Float, num1, num2, sum. And I'm going to do num1. I'm going to have to ask for a number. And I'm going to do num2. I'm going to have to ask for another number. So you'll notice that I just wrote the function calls. Now I'm going to write the actual functions. Ask number. And here's my printf. I'm going to say enter a number. And scanf. We're going to take a %f and some sort of a number, which I haven't created yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. And then I'm going to return num. Now, a lot of times when I write a program, I don't write the whole thing at once. I just do a little bit at a time, and I save it, and then I compile it. So don't forget, prototype up at the top. And then I'm going to save it, compile it, and run it. Now, I'm only going to run it a little bit, so 10 and 5. Now, it's not going to do anything else because I didn't tell it to, but I just want to make sure that this part works. So I asked for the number. So then the next thing I need to do is get the sum from add numbers. Now, remember, I have to give it whatever num1 was and whatever num2 was. And then I'll write that function here. It is going to return the sum, so the return data type is float. Add numbers. And it takes in two floats. Num1, num2. And it's got a very simple job here. So it's just going to, I'm going to do this the long way. I know some of you probably already know a shorter way, and that's fine if you know it. But for right now, keep it simple. Num1 plus num2, return sum. And then I already got the call, so now let me do the prototype. Yeah, semicolon at the end. Don't forget these semicolons. Next thing, save it. Save it, compile and run, just to make sure that it works. Still not seeing any output, but that's okay. I just want to make sure I got no runtime errors, any other kind of errors. So now I'm going to call a function that says print the sum, and I need to send it my sum. A lot of typos today, sorry. I must be tired. Here, this one's not going to return anything, so print sum, but it is going to take in a float sum. And printf. The sum of your numbers is %.2f and sum. Of course, copy the head. Let's copy the whole head. Control-C, semicolon. Let's clean this up just a little bit. Go ahead and save it, compile it, run it. 10, 5, 15. And there you go. There's your program. Okay, the last thing I want to do is just show you all of the parts to functions kind of put together. So we'll start from the top. Those are called function prototypes, and sometimes they're referred to as function declarations. They're declaring. They're not defining what they do, but they are declaring that they exist. So they're either called function prototypes or function declarations. Then you come down to your function calls. We are calling ask number a couple of times. We're calling add numbers, and we're calling print sum. So the things inside the parentheses are called function arguments. Remember, on the call and start an argument. follow down further, you have the function definition. So the entire thing is called a function definition. It consists of two parts. It consists of a function header and a function body. Within the function header, you have three things. You have a return data type, and remember, there's only one type of data that can be returned because functions can only return one value. Then you have the function name, and then you have any kind of function parameters. These are the variables or values, I should say, that they are expecting to get. And they need those values in order to do its job. Don't forget that anything inside the body are the things inside the curly braces. So this was your introduction to functions. Talk to you soon.